Welcome, everyone, to the RAND Policy Lab on the rise of AI. My name is Anita Chandra. I'm a vice president here at RAND. I oversee our work on social and economic well-being. In that capacity, we focus on the issues of promoting healthy and resilient populations, creating and building strong economies, and ensuring that we're protecting the environment and our justice system. We're working deeply on issues of inequity and inequality, which will be the focus of today's conversation. Before I introduce the session and our group of wonderful speakers, I wanted to cover two housekeeping notes. One, this webinar will be recorded. And then we're also planning for some time at the end for questions and answers. You can add your questions to the Q&A forum part of the Zoom tool, and I will be managing and facilitating the discussion near the end of our hour together. As I mentioned, this is a presentation in RAND's Policy Lab series, The Rise of AI. RAND experts in this series are discussing the evolution and the development of artificial intelligence, as well as the impact of AI across many policy sectors. Today, we're going to explore the issue of how do we manage the risks associated with AI and the potential ways that AI is and will exacerbate inequity and bias. I'm thrilled that we have three of our colleague researchers from RAND today joining us in this discussion. They will present some key points and concepts for the group. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have time for a short question and answer period. The first expert who will be part of today's discussion, Ben Boudreaux, is a policy researcher at RAND, also a professor at our RAND graduate school, our Party RAND graduate school. Ben has a terrific background. He works at the intersection of ethics and emerging technology, as well as human security. He's working specifically on the ethics of AI, but also related to issues of AI governance, catastrophic risk, and surveillance. Brandon Crosby, who will kick off the presentation shortly, is a behavioral scientist at RAND who primarily works in the area of organizational psychology, issues of personnel management, how to build diverse teams, how do we think about workforce diversity. He's done that in the context of both military and civilian sectors, and he's worked in both the public and private sector. And last but not least, we have Jessica Paige, who's a social scientist, a sociologist by training, and a professor as well at the Party RAND Graduate School. Her research interests include the areas of race and ethnicity, social mobility, culture, and qualitative methods. And with that, I will turn it over to Brandon to kick us off.
Hello, everyone. So we want to start by asking a fundamental question. What is AI? Next slide, please. So artificial intelligence, or AI, is the development of computer systems that can perform tasks typically requiring human intelligence. These tasks can range from visual perception, like facial recognition software, to complex decision-making and problem-solving. Large language models, such as ChatGPT, that are integrated into search, mental health therapies, education, and so forth, have all seen significant improvement over the past few years that show new dimensions of computer intelligence. The newest OpenAI model, GPT-4, does far better than most humans on the bar, LSAT, GRE, and many other tests, and it's only supposed to get smarter from here. AI can even create art, as seen in the AI-generated image here. It extends to physical systems too, like this Boston Dynamic robot that dances better than I do. And it shows AI that is capable in robotics and movement. Social media also uses AI to influence our daily lives, curating content, recognizing faces in photo, and targeting ads. AI is all around us, driving innovation and raising important questions about its role in our future. And with this wide array of applications, AI is more than just technology. It's a transformative force reshaping industries and our society. Next slide, please. But before we even get to the advanced AIs like large language modeling, let's take a look at this image search. When you search for nurses on a Google image search, the results predominantly show women. Meanwhile, a search for doctors shows mostly men. These images reinforce the stereotype that caregiving roles like nursing are women's work, while leadership roles in healthcare, like being a doctor, are more associated with men. Next slide, please. We see something similar when we look at the results for pilots and flight attendants. Again, pilots are overwhelmingly depicted as men, while flight attendants are mostly shown as women. Again, perpetuating a narrative that men are more likely to become pilots, as well as are in more positions of technical expertise and authority. Next slide, please. And finally, we see the pattern repeated again with CEOs, where CEOs are mostly men and secretaries are mostly women. The results have this show these deep-seated historical inequities and the lingering effects of patriarchy, suggesting that leadership and power are primarily male domains. However, we're just looking at images from a Google image search. Next slide, please. So what exactly is happening here? These search results are not created in a vacuum. They're powered by algorithms trained on existing images and historical data. These algorithms don't question or challenge the biases in the data. Instead, they simply reflect and amplify them. When AI systems reinforce these stereotypes, they risk shaping how people perceive professional roles, as well as other factors. This could discourage children or even adults from pursuing careers that don't align with entrenched stereotypes. And the problem isn't just representation. It's how these representations shape real-world opportunities and contribute to systemic inequities. The point I want to make here is that with just one simple search has an equity implication. And there's a dilemma of sorts regarding two choices a search company like Google can make. It can show the actual distribution of these roles, which leads to representational harms that further promotes inequity, or it can affirmatively show a more diverse distribution. But that might invite changes of inaccuracy and poor performance. As it stands, companies like Google are making these decisions on their own accord and subject to whatever criteria they prefer. What they show is the content that an AI determines will get someone to continue to engage with and ultimately click through the link. Google makes money off of ads, so decisions about what to present are made on grounds of engaging a user in order to sell advertising, not on grounds related to equity. For any given user, the results will be different based on their search history, location, or any other information that Google has available to statistically predict what the user will engage with. Note that this Google search example is just one of a multitude of these types of cases. Many others come up in the case of large language models like ChatGPT or image generation AI. New research from Hugging Face published a little while ago shows that similar gender and racial stereotypes are depicted in the newest image generation systems. And I want to dispel a common claim that AI and technically more generally, and technology more generally, is just science and math, and so doesn't have any normative or ethical import. Next slide, please. This common claim holds that AI is just inert pieces of code, not something of ethical significance. The books presented here and many others show that this is not true. AI and technology in general are inherently value-laden, and this is for a few reasons. Firstly, technology reflects the values and interests of those who create it and those who use it. The benefits and harms of technology are disparately distributed across communities. Some people benefit from technology, and those benefits and harms are actually accumulate over time. None of us can perfectly the distribution of benefits and harms, especially when it comes to new technologies with unknown capabilities. The distribution of these benefits and harms vary by social context in which AI is generated. And finally, in general, developing and deploying technology are choices tech companies and broader institutions are making. Building and deploying technology is not inevitable or deterministic. It is a choice. And by extension, the rest of us have a role in furthering or shaping these technologies too. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Brandon. So this talk is about one aspect of the ethical implications of AI, namely equity or fairness. So I'm going to spend a few slides now explaining what equity might mean and how that might be implemented in practice. So to take one definition from the Biden administration, the term equity means the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and partial treatment of all individuals. I think this definition is important for understanding how equity has been interpreted in governance, but the definition defines equity by other normative concepts: fairness, justice, impartiality, and each of those concepts are themselves deeply contested. There's literally thousands of years of literature trying to explain what is justice, including in the sacred books of perhaps all religions and spiritual traditions. So there's lots of dispute about what equity is, what it requires, and when it's achieved. And I think this is a challenge when trying to ensure that new technologies are equitable. Next slide, please. But despite some of those complexities I was just describing, there are distinctions that do help us make progress in understanding and implementing equity, including in technology deployment. So in this talk, we'll make reference to a framework that distinguishes three different elements of equity. First, we have procedural equity. This involves the decision-making process, who's included and who's left out. Contextual equity is about the political, cultural, economic, historical, or other factors that exclude or marginalize different individuals. And distributional equity is about the distribution of the benefits and burdens across individuals and communities. And these distributions compound or accumulate over time. So there's equity in procedures, equity in context, and equity in the ultimate distribution of benefits and burdens. And different moral theories emphasize these elements to different degrees, yet achieving each of them in the context of AI might be hard, and there might be trade-offs between them. Next slide, please. So fortunately, our government has codified these concepts and implemented them in practice. America's story is one of expanding circles of justice, from all men are created equal to an ever more inclusive vision of equality under the law. While the Constitution began with deep contradictions about slavery and exclusion, its core promise of equal protection was revolutionary. And later, the 14th Amendment enshrined equality, declaring no state shall deny, quote, the equal protection of the laws. But equality in the Constitution wasn't enough. The Civil Rights era recognized that both overt discrimination and other barriers needed to be addressed. This gave us watershed protections like the Civil Rights Act, which barred not just intentional discrimination, but also practices that appear neutral, yet disproportionately harm certain groups. And that's what's sometimes called disparate impact. So think about a test that fails women at much higher rates than men, or a bank's lending criteria that disadvantage minority neighborhoods. Even without someone having a discriminatory intent, these create real barriers to opportunity. And so that's why legislation and a series of court decisions have established that equality means examining outcomes, not just intentions. And I think these concepts reflect an evolving understanding that the American promise of equal opportunity requires actively dismantling systemic obstacles. And today, as AI reshapes society, major tech companies have publicly committed to building equity into their systems from the ground up. So OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPTs, their charter explicitly calls for AI that, quote, benefits all humanity. Google, their AI principles emphasize fairness and avoiding unfair biases. Microsoft has pledged to develop AI systems that treat all people fairly. And I think these companies recognize that as AI becomes more powerful and pervasive, ensuring it works fairly for everyone isn't just like an add-on. It's essential to fulfilling the same promises of equity that have driven American progress for generations. And researchers like us, those of us presenting today, but also American citizens across society, all have a role to play in identifying when technologies have disparate impact on communities. The companies themselves might not always be tracking these disparate impacts. And so it's where each of us, I think, can actively help promote these foundational values. Each of us might play a role. Next slide, please. So the challenge of bias in AI isn't just like one single problem. It's really a set of issues across the entire development and deployment pipeline of AI. So using this image, let's trace that development deployment pipeline from left to right here. It starts with the world itself. Historical inequities and societal biases get captured in everything from who gets loans to who gets hired to who gets arrested. And those real world disparities become embedded in our data. And that biased data then flows into training sets, like clinical trials that underrepresent certain populations, or facial recognition databases skewed towards particular demographics or facial features. Even with careful curation, these underlying biases can persist in that training data. And in the development of AI models, like specific technical choices really matter. So something as simple as choosing like which metrics to optimize can encode bias. Like if a developer tries to optimize for overall accuracy, this might come at the cost of fairness across different groups. And I should note the teams building these systems, the teams in Silicon Valley, are often quite homogenous, predominantly men, predominantly from certain educational and socioeconomic backgrounds. And this can create blind spots in how problems are framed and which edge cases gets considered. Moving next here, the model's output reflects these accumulated biases in subtle but important ways. And as the previous examples that Brandon mentioned, an image generation model might consistently place men in professional settings and women in domestic ones, which reinforce stereotypes with each output. And finally, in deployment, how these systems get used in the real world can amplify inequities. For instance, you'll hear shortly from Jessica about an AI hiring tool trained on historical data that perpetuates past discriminatory patterns, or a healthcare AI system that works better for majority populations than minorities. The key insight is that building equitable AI requires attention at every stage across this pipeline. We need a proactive effort throughout the pipeline to identify, measure, and mitigate these cascading effects. And now I'll turn it over to Jessica to talk about some specific examples of AI in practice. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Ben. So I'll go ahead and get started and talk about some examples of the ways in which you can see inequality perpetuated by AI. Can I go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to start off by talking about a study that I actually worked on with Ben and another one of our colleagues, Lindsay Ayer, on the use of AI surveillance software in schools. And so for this study, we looked at the use of this software. There are some main companies that make the software distributed to school districts across the country. So like BART, Gaggle, GoGuardian, Securely, some of you may have heard of these companies. And this is currently used, we think, in the majority of school districts across the country, although we don't have an exact number. But the software is marketed to be installed on school-issued computing devices, primarily tablets and Chromebooks, to identify students who may be at risk for facing some sort of challenge, often a mental health crisis or something else where they may pose a risk to themselves or students around them. And so the programs promise that they can help to identify these students by monitoring their use of computing devices and identify like early sort of red flags, what they're searching for, the websites they're visiting. Even the software has the ability to even read their email. And so if they send a disturbing message potentially to a peer using their school-issued computing device, the software may have the ability to detect that email and say, hey, this student is at risk. So these are appealing to school districts who are increasingly using school-issued computers for students to be able to learn in a variety of subjects, and students are taking them home. And students are also facing an increased number of mental health challenges, in particular, and other issues such as bullying. And so this is an attractive way for schools to put an extra set of eyes in place, right, to see what students are up to and make sure they're healthy and they're okay. But in our study, we interviewed teachers, doctors, and other stakeholders who are working or have worked with these programs. And we found that while there are potentially benefits, there are a number of risks. There are challenges regarding student privacy and data storage. So who's seeing all of this? So when the data, when a student does something and it's flagged as potentially at risk, the school has a lot of leeway in where that goes. It can go to a counselor, it can go to law enforcement. It can go a number of places. And so who's actually viewing the data that the students, that flags students, right? And that provides information about their daily lives. And then how accurate is the software? So we found in our study, and others have found as well, that the software may have a tendency to flag certain things that do not indicate risk, but may target certain groups of students. So LGBTQ students, for instance, have reported being tagged by the software more often for searches related potentially to sexual orientation or gender. We've found in some cases reports that students of color have been more likely to be flagged by the program. And it's challenging because this is a situation where the programs are run by private companies, so we don't exactly know what it is about the algorithm, but there is a potential for the algorithm, even though the programs may be well-meaning, to create and perpetuate inequality. Okay, I'll go to the next slide, please. So we've seen the potential for these types of AI programs to perpetuate and create and perpetuate inequality in other spaces. Another big one is the criminal justice system. So there have been some courts that have started using AI systems to identify offenders who may be at particular risk for recidivism. There's one program in particular that we're going to talk about here that uses Compass. And in this case, they're supposed to be using a combination of factors: race, poverty, employment, prior convictions, or I'm saying not race, residence, poverty, employment, and prior convictions to potentially identify people who may be at higher risk for recidivism, so maybe need more monitoring. Next, please. So ProPublica actually looked at Compass more closely and found out, despite the fact that they say that race is not a part of the algorithm, it's again residence, poverty, past convictions, Black defendants were 2 times more likely to be identified as future offenders than white defendants. The program also mislabeled white defendants as low risk much more than Black defendants. So this is a situation where the algorithm, while the program may be well-meaning, the algorithm has something baked into it that is then profiling the Black defendants essentially at a higher rate. Next slide, please. So the makers of Compass have, just disputed the fact that the software is perpetuating any racial inequality or encouraging racial profiling. Says that the error rate is based on potentially different. Well, so what we're seeing is potentially based on differential rates of criminality by race and gender that are then feeding the algorithm. So essentially, it's not Compass's fault if one group has higher rates of criminality than another, is what they're saying. And the error rate is not necessarily an indicator of a measure of equity. So this is another example, again, of the way that we may see this. Again, Compass is saying this is not the case, this is not their intention, but the outcome when the program is used is that we have Black offenders who are more likely to be identified as potentially at risk for recidivism in an inaccurate way. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay, and one more example, and this was an example from Amazon. Actually, a lot of folks may have heard of this. I remember this story from a few years ago when they started using an AI tool that they developed to screen resumes, right? Seems like a reasonable way to screen out that initial large batch that you may get in. But they found pretty quickly that the algorithm was discriminating, or it was biased against women, essentially, because it was more likely to screen out applicants that had certain characteristics. So if your resume mentioned that you participated in a women's group, for instance, it was more likely to screen out your resume. If you attended a women's only college, it was more likely to screen out your resume. So while the idea may have been this is a shorthand way to get through that big initial batch of applicants, there was no ill will on the part of Amazon initially. The result, based on what the algorithm was doing, was screening out women at a disproportionately high rate. Next slide, please. So from these examples, we can see that AI has the potential to promote equity. So it may, in the Amazon case, for example, the idea was that there would be some automation. It would standardize hiring, reduce subjective bias in resume screening and evaluations. They could have the potential to be accessible, to enhance inclusivity, to be efficient, make data-driven decisions. That's potentially the idea behind using the recidivism software made by Compass. On the other hand, there's a high risk that of these algorithms creating or reinforcing inequality. So historical data can be fed into the systems, can be fed into the algorithm, therefore perpetuating inequality in certain situations. There can be transparency issues, like in the case of the schools, where you don't exactly know what is feeding the algorithm and how decisions are being made. And you can have this unintentional, uneven impact. Schools being an example again, where bias surfaces in the outcomes. So you may have LGBTQ students, for instance, in the example of the schools, being flagged as being at risk at a disproportionately high rate because of something that is fed into the algorithm. Next slide, please. And so there are a lot of other examples of this happening. I feel like there are stories pretty regularly coming out now about the ways in which bias can impact AI algorithms. So there's an example from from Rite Aid's AI facial recognition software, for example, where it was wrongly tagging people of color as shoplifters. There's a great example from Google Translate, where you, sorry, I'm still stuck there, but there was an example from Google Translate where if you put something in that isn't gendered, like if you're getting this person is a doctor translated from Turkish into English and they don't have a gendered qualifier, Google will then say he is a doctor, she is a nurse, and so automatically sort of inserting some level of bias into the translation process. So this is just a couple of examples. Another one is Amazon Prime having some issues potentially delivering to certain neighborhoods, and is this something that's being perpetuated by their algorithms? Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of the ways in which equity can impact AI and the use of AI, and we hope to now move on to your questions and think more about these issues. We also have a good amount of work here at RAND where folks are looking more closely, so you can scan the QR codes and look at some of the work that we're doing. But we're now ready to open it up and hopefully have a great conversation about the ways in which this is impacting our daily lives.
Great. Thanks, Jessica and Brandon and Ben. Please do keep the questions coming. I'm going to kickstart with a few questions that I see that I think hit on some important buckets and theme areas that I know the panelists would like to respond to and others would love to hear. I'll start with Valerie Michelle, and this is a question that I'll first lob to Ben. We talk a lot about the ethical considerations related to technology, and of course, you laid out some of the equity balancing trade-offs in this. But Valerie asks, how does the ethical considerations extend beyond the technology itself and into the larger energy intensity burden, as just one example of trade-offs? How does that intersect with regulation, policy, and the need for free and fair use? So how are we kind of thinking about these in the context of equitable access and development? So I thought I'd start with Ben, just given the framing that you offered. Ben?
Yeah, great. Thanks. That's a tremendous question and something that researchers at RAND and elsewhere are tracking closely. Yeah, I mean, just to give some background, the most advanced so-called frontier AI models require massive amounts of energy to train them. Microsoft actually is trying to reopen 3 Mile Island to have a nuclear reactor to power data centers simply for developing and deploying AI models. Other companies are also looking to restart nuclear energy or otherwise try to get access to just tremendous amounts of energy generation just to develop and deploy these models. So the energy intensity is quite extreme. And these companies hope that these systems, once they're developed and deployed, will actually help improve climate change. So they'll actually help optimize for energy efficiency or help us better capture solar power or something like that. That's the promise that these companies made. But I should note that as it stands, these data centers and training these models are climate negative. And many of the companies have actually gone backwards on their climate commitments about emissions. And again, they're hoping that once they get the AIs out, that they will be able to meet those climate commitments. But as it stands, that they're actually going backwards. And I think this is clearly an environmental justice issue, since we know that climate change affects communities differently. And so I think one could ask, like, are these AI development and deployments, are they further harming marginalized communities because of this climate effect? And I think that's an important research question that folks are looking at, and I think we need to do more research to address it. A related point is that I think the high demands for energy for these models means that really only some companies can develop them, and that they're going to be looking to sell them. They're going to be looking to make profit for the high amounts of energy that they're putting into it. And so I think what that means is a further concentration of power among the big players that can afford the massive energy demands of training these models. And I think that's also an equity issue. And that really gets at some of the questions of, like, procedural equity of who is a part of the decision-making process and who's excluded from those discussions. So I think that's a great question. I don't have a full answer, just noting that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to address that very topic. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. And I really appreciate that question as well. As Ben noted, we're doing some work on those issues at RAND. I would also argue that some of the investments in energy production might be an economic boon for some communities, and trading off those issues of sustainability, access to AI will become even more salient. We don't actually have the production capacity at the point we need to for some of these data centers. So there's both a practical and an ethical and equity one. So thank you for that question. I'm going to go to Brandon to respond to the next question that we have from Jim Dunnigan from ASU, to kind of unpack a little bit the notion of implicit bias, specifically that's already baked into large language models, or LLMs. And Jim, thank you for the article that you also offered in the Q&A. But Brandon, do you want to speak to implicit bias in LLMs?
Sure. So LLMs and models like it are trained on massive amounts of text from the internet. This is everything from books and articles to social media posts and forums. But the thing is, all that data comes from humans, and humans have biases. And those biases, whether intentional or not, are baked into the content the models learn from. And I use bake intentionally because we can kind of think as models as an oven. And if you have a dough that has too much salt in it, the outcome is going to be too salty. The oven cannot separate the salt out from it. Because LLMs, they don't understand the world like we do. They just find patterns in their training data and they replicate them. So if the data contains stereotypes, discriminatory language, or one-sided perspectives, then the model is likely to reflect that. So for example, it might associate certain professions like nurses being more often with women, more seen with women, or engineers more often with men. And it might even subtly reflect racial or cultural biases by favoring Western norms or marginalizing voices from other cultures. So the hard part is that these biases are often implicit, so they're not really obvious, and they might show up in subtle word associations or the way certain groups are described. You might not notice it unless you're specifically looking for it. But even if it's subtle, it can have real-world consequences. So when you use models like them in hiring tools, legal systems, or education, as we've seen in this presentation, they could unintentionally influence decisions in biased ways. They might reinforce stereotypes that discourage people from pursuing careers or create outputs that underrepresent marginalized communities. And over time, this can continue to contribute to systemic inequities, even though the bias isn't deliberate. So what can we do about it? Well, first of all, addressing the bias in LLMs starts with recognizing that the training data needs to be more diverse and representative. Developers could also possibly create tools to identify and measure bias in outputs, and there's a push for stronger ethical guidelines to ensure fairness. But even with these efforts, human oversight is always crucial, and people need to monitor and correct outputs, especially in situations where biased decisions could have serious consequences.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate that. And thanks again for sharing that article, Jim. So I'm going to go to Jessica next on a kind of a paired set of questions related to schools and education. A broader question about what AI will do in terms of disrupting or helping education, which has been a point of fierce debate within RAND, and then specifically to the school safety work and what these providers are under contract to do. So Ann Pearson raises a great question of this. Beyond inequity and bias in the results which AI produces, which we've been talking about today, how will the inequity be produced by lack of education around effective and safe uses of AI? In other words, will some students be left behind as AI moves ahead, increasing the tech divide and some of our concerns in educational equity? So Jessica, do you want to take that one?
I think that's a really great question and a great point. Despite all of the challenges that we've discussed with AI, it's very much becoming a significant part of our daily lives. And so along with other technology, having access to it in different spaces, learning about AI, using programs, understanding how it works is going to be an important part of someone's toolkit, so to speak. And so I think that there is a real possibility that inequality could be further perpetuated by just differential access to tools. So, I mean, I think a great example could be just thinking through it, potentially if it is used more in the workplace, or, whether it be anything from hiring, promotion, to the way that you do your job. And so if you're not used to whatever software programs are out there, however these programs operate on your devices, then it could really put you at a disadvantage in the workplace. And so I don't know how much this is currently being integrated into how schools talk about and think about technology and differential access, but certainly something that is important and on the horizon. The good news is I think there is potential for more equity, in the sense that a lot of things that are being used, if you do have, whether it be a cell phone or a tablet, you can gain access. We're not as much in the days of like you had to buy some huge software suite. And there's a lot of cloud programs and things like that you can download and start to learn about emerging technology or start to use emerging technology. So there are ways, I think, that schools can intervene that may not be terribly costly, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as a point of debate at RAND, some are feeling like the adoption of ed tech won't be as fast as some are suggesting. Others within our organization argue that AI could actually help at the point of entry with teachers, particularly with new teachers, as well as teachers that need support and assistance. And even though it's not perfect to develop lessons plan, it gets you maybe 40% of the way there. So those are some of the things that are also coming up at RAND in terms of teacher capabilities and the like. But again, the equity issue, important to note. I'll just stick one more question with Jessica, and then we'll go back to the questions around operational frameworks. Mila had asked Vikor, and sorry if I misspoke your name, had a specific question, I think, that's related to the school safety work that you talked about, Jessica, that you did with Ben and others. Regarding the AI being utilized in school districts, have you reviewed the contracts of these companies and how much leeway they have to utilize the data acquired from students for other purposes? I'm curious whether these school districts are being thoughtful about the use of these data beyond the simple desire to protect students from self-harm and suicide. Also wondering how aware students and their parents are about the software on their students' mandated school devices. So just kind of, did you get underneath the hood a bit on that project?
Sure, definitely. And Ben, also feel free to jump in at any point too, since also a co-author on the study. This is a very challenging space to work in. We talked with school districts that are not super open about the use of the software and the terms that they've come to with companies. Companies are also not very open about this, and there are very few regulations. So a lot of this is up to the companies and the school districts. So companies have taken pledges to protect student privacy, and school districts have certain regulations under FERPA, but this isn't really, it's not clear how much is covered. regarding this emerging technology under some existing law like FERPA. And so it's a very messy space. The companies are basically self-monitoring. And so we heard a variety of different things that were happening at the school level in terms of how students were monitored, what was happening with data. In some cases, if a student is flagged, it's sent to, again, like I said, if they think there's a real threat, it could be sent to law enforcement. Law enforcement has that data. Now, it's not clear if there's any protection around that. Some parents expressed concern that the schools were putting flags on students' records, and there's no regulation that they can't do that. We know at least one company sends the data, the flags, when students are flagged by the software, they send it to their own sort of offsite lab for their employees to analyze. And then they take that data to the school and say, okay, there's a flag for the student, there's a flag for the student. So that there's multiple people that have access to the data. There's no governance around that. So it really is a very challenging space that is certainly in need of regulation, and whether or not parents and students know. So a lot of times, for the districts that we looked at, folks have to essentially opt out of the technology. Or opt out of the monitoring. So if you want a school issued device, if you want the Chromebook, you need to basically agree to be monitored by this software. And if you opt out, then you may need to provide your own technology to use to do your schoolwork. And so it seems in a lot of places, probably people are kind of signing off because they want the Chromebook, and it's not clear how carefully folks are reading about this specific issue with the software. And so we heard varying things about how much parents and students really know about everything that's being monitored. And in some cases, people really aren't finding out until something is flagged, until someone's called into the principal's office. In the worst case scenario, a law enforcement officer could be called, but they may not know that, for instance, their school computer had the ability to read their personal email if they were logged on their school computer, until they do something that somehow gets flagged by the program. Ben, do you want to jump in at all? I know since you're a co-author, if you want to say anything.
I mean, I think you covered it really well, making the point that there's a real lack of governance in this space, and a lot of lack of awareness among parents, even among teachers, even among school counselors, since many times these systems are set up by the technology or like the information department versus someone working in mental health. That's one of the many challenges. But I think, Jessica hit on the other points I would make. Thanks for the question.
Great. Well, thanks, Jessica. We're going to turn to Adam's question, and I might pull up Olivia's question as well. We'll turn it to Ben first. So Adam asked a great question about what criteria should we think about to decide on the relevant concept of equity for a given application? Differential concepts, for example, error rate equivalence versus distributional differences in the predictions across groups, often result in opposite conclusions about the relative fairness of two candidate models. So how should we be thinking about this, and how are you approaching this, certainly in your work, Ben?
Yeah, thanks. This is a great question. I think it's certainly true that different conceptions of equity and fairness might be somewhat in tension. There might be trade-offs of these different values. And that does create a real challenge to try to figure out how to implement AI fairly. I would note, though, that these types of trade-offs are very common in policy debates. This is sort of throughout any policy consideration. There's going to be trade-offs of different considerations. And I think the best that we can do is look to democratic deliberation to have a process for figuring out what fairness means in particular implementations or particular applications. Of course, that democratic deliberation itself needs to be equitable. We need all parties impacted by the technology to be represented and to be able to participate in those discussions. And of course, there's often many barriers to that type of inclusivity. So we don't always get the sort of open, inclusive deliberations that I think are necessary to determine the right way to navigate these different trade-offs. And another point I would make about this is I think it's what type of fairness we want with an AI is really going to be application specific. And in many cases, different domains have worked out what fairness means within that domain. So to take an example, We have sort of take employment, for instance. There's an agency in the federal government called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which itself seeks to monitor and enforce fairness or inequity in employment decisions. And the EEOC lays out specific standards that it looks for to determine whether or not a given application is unfair. For instance, if it has a disparate impact on some groups more than others. And the EEOC has been very clear that it doesn't matter if it's a human that's doing the discrimination that leads to a disparate impact, or if it's an AI system. Right. And employers sometimes, look to AI and they think that maybe, if an AI is making the employment decision, this removes the responsibility or the liability from the human. Well, the EEOC has said that's not the case, that if an employer is using AI and it leads to the unfair impact that the EEOC identifies, then that employer is responsible, even though they're using the AI. And so I think here, again, we need to look at the specific application and what type of institutions we have in place to enforce or to monitor for these different inequities. And I think that really speaks to the need for clear processes, like the process I was just laying out with the EEOC, but also resourcing, right? I mean, as AI is being used more broadly across these domains, we need people that are able to understand how AI is being used and be able to ensure that AI is being implemented subject to the specific values and the specific, trade-offs that are permissible within that domain. And so I think we really need to think about the human side of this as well, and ensure that there's enough humans that are using their judgment to undertake considered, review, ensuring that the AIs are being used well, and again, are protecting equity or fairness in those specific applications. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ben. I'm going to ask if the panelists want to be able to respond to Olivia's question in the chat, actually, if there are good socio-technical frameworks that you're using in policy and AI implementation. Olivia, this is an area of great focus at RAND in terms of socio-technical transitions and systems analysis. So we'll throw some things in the chat. In the interest of time, I'm going to combine some, I think, points that Isbat and David Mannheim are raising and throw it to Brandon, and then we'll do one more question about policy. And I think they're getting at sort of similar points. So Isbat's asking, what about policies and regulations, right? Given that individuals and organizations are inherently or often willfully biased themselves, it's quite unlikely that AI will make unbiased decisions if, you're drafting off of those inputs, one. And then David sort of hits a related point, which is it was mentioned that algorithms reflect existing biases. That's, of course, very unfortunate. But when compared to human decision-making, even significantly less biased, but imperfect AI systems will have a measurable bias, so that it seems that we're asking for a superhuman level of fairness from the models. So should there be a higher legal or ethical bar for AI bias than human bias? How should we meter and calibrate human bias, AI bias, other forms of bias? What say you, Brandon?
Sure. I'll start with talking about the policies, because those are crucial. So policies can enforce standards for data used to train AI systems, and we've talked about how important the data is to those systems. And AI is only as unbiased as the data it learns from. So regulations should require the diverse and representative data sets, while also auditing for historical and systemic biases. Policies also need to reinforce transparency. Organizations should be required to disclose how data is collected and processed, so we can understand the limitations of the system. And accountability mechanisms are essential. So bias testing should be mandatory before deployment, and regular assessment should continue afterwards. Regulations also need to define what fairness looks like. And I think this is where we get to the next question. And with fairness, you're absolutely right. Algorithms, they only reflect existing biases, and while imperfect, they might often be less biased than human decision-making. And AI, when designed thoughtfully, has the potential to reduce these biases in measurable ways. But AI systems operate at a scale and speed that human decision simply can't match. And when an AI system's bias, it can propagate that bias across thousands or even millions of decisions in an instant. So this really amplifies the impact of the bias in ways that human decision-making rarely does. And because AI decisions often feel more objective or authoritative to the people affected by them, they can be harder to recognize and challenge. So should we have this higher legal or ethical bar for AI bias than for humans? I think that yes, and for a couple of reasons. First, so unlike human decision making, AI systems are designed and deployed intentionally. So human thought is used for all types of reasons, but AI systems have an objective in mind often. So this gives us the opportunity and responsibility to mitigate bias at every step, from the data used to train the models all the way to the way the outputs are monitored. So we really should hold AI to a higher standard that reflects that these systems are, in a sense, man-made artifacts that we can engineer and improve over time. AI systems are often deployed in contexts where the stakes are high, as we've talked about in this presentation: hiring, lending, healthcare, criminal justice. And in these areas, even small biases can lead to widespread inequities. And a higher bar for AI would help ensure that we're minimizing harm and maximizing fairness in these applications. And lastly, because AI systems are new and evolving, they really come with an opportunity to establish norms and expectations. We're going to be having a very different discussion on AI in 2030. And a lot of what we're going to talk about has its foundation in what we discussed today. So by holding AI to a higher standard now, we can set the stage for innovation that actively promotes equity rather than simply replicating historical inequities.
Great. Well, thanks, Brandon. Well, I'm going to sort of pull a couple questions into one for our final question and ask Ben and maybe Jessica to jump in, but very briefly. So Kevin Indeje, and again, if I butcher your name, I apologize, is asking the question that we think a lot about at RAND, like many of you. What steps should be taken or are being taken with policymakers to think through the differential impacts on historically marginalized communities? What can we do around building some public trust around AI deployment and the rapid development of these things? And there were some other questions down the line that, how do we balance all these equity and creativity points? State legislatures are thinking about, how do we not tie developers' hands behind their back, but also make sure that we are continuing to build public trust, particularly with underrepresented communities. So how should we think about the policymaker trust communities relationship going forward?
Yeah, thanks. That's another great question, and something that's an active area of research for me and others at RAND and elsewhere. And I think it really does require a proactive effort. In many cases, the impacts of technologies, are just not anticipated. Like tech companies don't have an incentive to necessarily anticipate all the downstream effects of a technology deployment. And so it does require an active effort from government, from civil society, from folks to try to understand those different impacts. And I think one way the government can do a better job of this is by really doing different studies that are looking at the public's perception and trying to reach members of the public that might not always be included in different discussions. And so I've been involved in several studies for the Department of Homeland Security that's looked at how they have deployed AI, for instance, facial recognition in airports or in other types of public events to try to accomplish various types of security missions. And we've done various surveys and focus groups of the public to try to understand what the public thinks about those different technology deployments. And this is all an attempt to try to build some of that public trust that the question suggested is so important. And I'll just mention a couple of the outcomes of those public perception studies. One is that many people are actually neutral with respect to how the government is going to be using different technologies. They haven't yet formed an opinion about it. And so there's room here for the government to do a better job of engaging those different communities and implementing different safeguards, and to try to encourage those folks to actually trust these deployments. Secondly, we found that actually many members of the public don't care so much about what specific technology is being used. They don't really care if it's, what type of facial recognition system is being used or what type of large language model, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or some other. It really doesn't matter the specifics of the technology. What matters are the details of the application itself. and that they're way more comfortable with, say, facial recognition being deployed in a context like an airport, where people know that they're going to be, in some sense, under some extra scrutiny, and it's in a contained environment, right? Versus facial recognition on the open streets or at a protest. And so they care more about like those types of applications than they care about the details of the technology. And the last point we found is that across all types of demographics, safeguards really matter. And that includes things like opt-out provisions, clear notification that a certain technology is being used, clear description of the different privacy protections associated with the data that's collected, and the like. And I do think those types of safeguards, along with additional engagements of the public, can go a long way to try to foster this type of public trust. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. Well, I know we're coming up on time. We couldn't get to everybody's questions, but hopefully we got some of the key ones. And this is really an open conversation. You have the items here, the QR codes, to link to a lot of RAND work in the space on the development and the deployment of artificial intelligence, as well as our deeper work on the legal, ethics, and equity dimensions of AI and other emerging technology. We hope that you will avail yourself of those resources, sign up for our newsletters, follow us on social media. We'll put some of those additionally in the chat. And we want to be in conversation with you as points of connection and collaboration. Many of you have great expertise and insights. We'll be sharing some more, hopefully in the chat shortly, but also reach to us if you had any additional questions or we weren't able to connect and follow up. I want to thank Jessica and Brandon and Ben for their leadership and expertise today. And they represent a larger team at the organization that is working on these topics and is welcoming insights and perspectives and all of the various contradictions and trade-offs that we talked about today. With that, before we conclude, we have one poll question that we will put on the screen. We would love to hear from you about your response to today's event. We will be continuing the Policy Lab on the rise of AI, so please look out for announcements on future topics in this space and in other areas that RAND covers. With that, thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.